This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
This is Fortune's Wheel, podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. Your time is your greatest currency, make no mistake, and this fact of life does not go unnoticed by the creators on whom you spend your time. So thank you for spending your time listening and learning along with me on this podcast. Now, on this episode, we will be continuing to merge in and out our Patreon-only series called The Book of Alexios, which details all of those parts of Alexios Komnenos' story that just don't make it into the public podcast. And we're merging that, of course, with the series detailing the Normans in Italy and Sicily, because these two storylines will inevitably smash into one another very, very soon, actually. And as I said, a little bit's already begun, that smashing into each other. To be clear, we're not finished with our Patreon series entitled The Book of Alexios. We will continue it on Patreon, but there will be times when the two storylines merge. What happens in this particular episode directly pertains to what we'll see from Robert Guiscard, which is why I chose to include this one on the public feed. I'm really actually excited about it, so I hope you enjoy it. Before we continue, I do want to do a quick shout out. I've got so happy about these two folks who have jumped on and become supporting members on our Patreon page. I urge everyone to go over there. We've got I'm very proud of our Patreon series. We have a series on Poland. We have a series on the background of, what's going on in the continent during the Norman conquest of England. We've got a bunch of things going on there, and we're currently in, as I've said, this Book of Alexios, which is all the background information on the great Alexios Komnenos. And I just want to do two quick shout outs to these folks who decided to jump on and become supporting members. Luke Gauchi, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And Jez O'Leary, you're brilliant. Thank you so much. Again, I urge everyone to go over there for as little as $1 a month. All this could be opened up to you, and you could enjoy those Patreon series as well. So I will move on. There's my pitch. But thank you to those two new members. Very, very happy that you've joined us. Now, for a quick primer of this episode, the Eastern Roman Emperor Nikephoros III Botaniates, he begins to read the writing on the wall. And that's actually a curious phrase, to read the writing on the wall. I want to start off this episode by taking a look at the origins of the phrase before getting into the next chapter of Alexios' story, shall we? Also, there will be a little game you play as you listen, so I'm curious to hear what y'all come up with, so pay close attention. This is episode 130, and it's also serving as Patreon episode 23, entitled The Book of Alexios, Chapter 4, The Writing on the Wall. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. For better or for worse. It's not always positive, but it's not always negative either. It actually comes from the Old Testament of the Bible, a story among the oldest in Jewish tradition. Now, I'm no biblical scholar, and I wouldn't even call myself Christian per se, insofar as I was born and raised in a Judeo-Christian-centered Western nation. But I am a big fan of the stories within the Judeo-Christian faith. Beautiful works most of the time. I mean, nothing's perfect, right? But I maintain that the Bible was, at the very least, intentional. What's in it was intended to serve some purpose. The stories within were not simply collected, rather they were selected. They were curated. And the book itself is full of lessons that speak far beyond the generation that they occurred in. Those lessons are indeed timeless. Like it or not, the very society we live in today, at least in the West, which is the freest, the healthiest, the wealthiest, and the most culturally, racially, and spiritually diverse civilization in world history, in fact. And I say that, warts and all, this society was built upon the foundations of these stories and these lessons. Proof of things like this can always be found in the language we use. In fact, many of our phrases we use today come from this deeply ancient Judeo-Christian tradition. The phrase, the powers that be, refers to the people in positions of power over others. And this comes from Romans chapter 13, verse 1, when it says, quote, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained by God," end quote. If you narrowly escape a perilous situation, then you would say that you escaped by the skin of your teeth. This comes from the utterly sadistic, I say that jokingly, book of Job, specifically chapter 19, verse 20. It says, quote, "My bone cleaveth to my skin and to my flesh, and I am escaped with the skin of my teeth." And one that might strike home a little too closely for many of us today, regardless of our country of origin, is the blind leading the blind, denoting a complete lack of trust in our leaders due to their seeming incompetence. This originates from the book of Matthew, chapter 15, verse 14. It says, quote, "Let them alone. They be blind leading the blind, and if the blind shall lead the blind, both shall fall into a ditch," end quote. And there are so many others that come from this book. A leopard can't change its spots. A wolf in sheep's clothing. A thorn in the side. Cast the first stone. Go the extra mile. A drop in the bucket. I mean, the list just goes on and on. Listen, far be it of me to proselytize to anyone, especially a religious system that I don't necessarily subscribe to, at least with regards to its faith. But being a part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, as most of my listeners I'm assuming are, whether they like it or not, or whether they personally claim it or not, comes with certain points of common understanding that I feel are important to learn. With regards to this podcast, I would say that knowing where many of our ideas, values, and language comes from, whether we subscribe again to the faith behind it or not, is one of our highest duties as citizens and subjects of our Western homelands. So let's play a game, shall we? As you listen, I challenge you to identify all the phrases that originate from the Bible that I may say. Jump on the comment section attached to this episode and tell us how many you found. Even list them if you want. And it starts now. Don't include any we've already said. There are probably going to be plenty ahead. And this finally leads us to the title of this episode and the book of Daniel from the Old Testament of the Bible. The book of Daniel is the story of a Jewish statesman who, during the Babylonian exile of the Jews in the Old Testament, worked his way up to the position of, you could say, reader of dreams for the Babylonian king named Belshazzar, which was actually a pretty solid gig, all things considered. Well, one day, Belshazzar threw a lavish feast drinking from vessels looted from Solomon's temple during his predecessor's reign, the notorious King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, during the festivities, in front of all to see, a mysterious invisible hand began writing words on the room's wall. The words were, "Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin." Over the preceding few days, not a single one of the king's magicians or wise men could decipher these Aramaic words scrawled on the king's wall. So the king pulled in this so-called Jewish prophet named Daniel to take a crack at it. Remember, even if one was to speak truth to the king, it was still a very dangerous thing to do. But Daniel interpreted the words as follows. Mene means God has numbered your kingdom. And remember, this word was repeated, so there's not only this interpretation present, but a finality equating to God has declared its end, which was also implied by the repetition. So Mene, Mene means God has numbered your kingdom and God has declared its end. So next, Tekel. Daniel said, Tekel meant, quote, "You have been weighed upon the scales of God's justice and been found wanting," Basically, you're not enough. You're not good enough. All right? And finally, upharsin was revealed to mean your kingdom shall be divided and given to the various people of the land. Now, the land here was Babylon, which is pretty universally agreed to have been the foundations of the modern capital of Iraq, actually Baghdad. The Persians and the Medes, who both hailed from out east in modern-day Iran, were to inherit Belshazzar's kingdom. Now, bold words for a Jewish nobody, wouldn't you say? Well, Babylon was invaded very soon after. It says really the next day, but, Babylon was invaded and Babylon fell. It fell to Cyrus the Great's Persian Empire. The book of Daniel implies Belshazzar was killed that very night that Daniel made his interpretations known. But outside of the biblical account, both Xenophon and Herodotus recorded it a little later. So it's giving it an extra biblical context as well. Either way, Belshazzar died and Cyrus the Great gave Babylon to one of his loyalists named Darius the Mede. So Daniel was correct. And that is the story of our modern phrase writing on the wall. But what does all of this have to do with Alexios Komnenos? To say something I've alluded to many times in the past, these stories, whether we agree with them or believe in them or not, these stories were very much alive in the hearts and minds of the Christian West. In order to understand these people and our shared history, one must attempt to incorporate the beliefs and philosophies and stories, and on the last episode on the Patreon series, the myths these people held near and dear to them, help them understand the world around them. This allows us to understand the decisions they made and the outcomes of those decisions. Don't forget the Thomas theorem we've explained on the podcast already. To be clear, I'm not trying to preach. I'm merely trying to understand. So again, our question, what does all this have to do with Alexios Komnenos? Let's see. A once mighty empire with a capital city that was the wonder of its world, that established full and complete regional dominance, was floundering under mismanagement and corruption a number of decades after one of its greatest leaders died. Anyone else getting Eastern Roman vibes here? Eastern Rome in the year 1080 was a completely different empire than it was in 1025 upon the death of the incomparable Emperor Basil II, the old Bulgar slayer himself. Since then, emperor after emperor after empress after emperor had tried and failed to pull the nose up on this doomed airplane. Well, except for one, that is, Isaac I Komnenos, but his reign was so short it left nothing but a blip on the radar. However, it did stand as a testament for the possibility of the empire's woes being overcome, so it wasn't nothing. But even those days seemed like ancient history by 1080. Now, looking at the state of Eastern Rome at the opening of the 1080s, anyone with eyes could see that Eastern Rome was suffering from the blind leading the blind. These people had absolutely no clue what the empire needed to not only recover, but to survive. They themselves, however, felt they were the apple of the empire's eye, and having reached the pinnacle of the empire's political hierarchy, they could simply sit back, eat, drink, and be merry. As the decade opened up, it had needed the services of young Alexios Komnenos to stamp out three major threats already. The Norman Roussel de Bayol, the entirely capable general Nikephoros Bryennius, and the animal Basilakios. With the exception of the Norman who just sought to create his own state, the other two threats sought to be the next cure for the empire, though they were actually oblivious to the fact that their very causes were the roots of the problems that plagued the empire in the first place. Each of them, Roussel included though, suffered from a crippling case of hamartia, a Greek term meaning a fatal flaw that leads to the downfall of a potential hero or heroine. Now, in the year 1080, Alexios Komnenos was just then around 31 years old. We focused on his military career so far, and to be sure, that was the history that was most relevant. However, He'd been up to more than just putting down rebellions and potential usurpations. Sure, he'd traveled the breadth of the empire, from the Western Balkans to the Eastern Anatolian highlands. He'd engaged the Seljuks, the Bulgars, the Normans, and even the Greeks in battle. And he'd outsmarted some of the brightest the empire had to offer at the time. But he was also balancing the precarious situation in the capital as well. To begin with, Alexios Komnenos got married prior to Nikephoros Botaniates rising to the throne. He married a girl named Irene Doukaina. It's criminally immoral and gross to us today, but history requires accuracy, so here goes. Irene was 11 at the time of her wedding, and Alexios at the time of the wedding was in his mid-20s. Now, to be sure, her family was unwilling to allow Alexios to actually consummate the marriage, and there's all evidence to suggest that Alexios honored the tradition of waiting until the bride had at least reached adolescence. But I mean, all the same, ew. But there were rumors that there were other reasons why Alexios didn't consummate the marriage, beyond being an honorable man of his time. See, Michael VII Doukas had married a beautiful Georgian princess named Maria of Aliana. Empress Maria and Emperor Michael VII had a son, Constantine Doukas, named after the boy's grandfather, Emperor Constantine X. This was the boy that Michael VII betrothed to Helena, the daughter of Duke Robert Guiscard, remember? Well, when Michael VII was pushed out of the capital and into a nearby monastery, Empress Maria masterfully pulled off the old Emma of Normandy and saved herself and her young son from either certain death or induced obscurity. This was in the year 1078. But 1079, by that time, Alexios Komnenos had already figured out the Roussel de Bayol situation, fought off Nikephoros Bryennius, engaged the Seljuk Turks in various small skirmishes as they tested the borders, and he'd helped to install the new emperor, the now husband of Maria of Aliana. This afforded Alexios and his older brother Isaac a proverbial open-door policy to the imperial palace in Constantinople. Not only did this allow the Komneni boys free access to the emperor, but it also afforded access to the gymnasium, or women's quarters, of the Blachernae Palace. So, under Nikephoros III, the palace structure was this. Nikephoros III was married to the ex-wife of a Doukas emperor, making her in some sense directly linked still to the powerful Doukas family, especially since she was the mother of the heir to the crown. In addition to that, this young heir's great uncle, John Doukas, the man formerly, if you remember, hailed as emperor by Roussel de Bayol. See, John Doukas had resumed his role as power broker under Michael VII and now Nikephoros III. So he was actually Caesar John Doukas, which Caesar is second in charge. John Doukas still had considerable influence over the political system. It's worth noting that. Like considerable influence. Again, he was a Caesar. Now that said, Alexios and Isaac Komnenos were two leaders in the military world at the time, the emperor's right-hand men, for all intents and purposes. So they frequented the palace on that premise alone. However, Alexios was also married to, again, young Irene Doukaina. And if it's not obvious, that makes Irene a Doukas, given that it was customary to add a different suffix to a family name to denote male or female. Irene Doukaina was a Doukas in the same way that Anna Komneni was the daughter of Alexios Komnenos. You see how the endings flipped based on male or female. Now, having married Irene Doukaina, Alexios had direct access to Caesar John Doukas, giving him another premise with which to visit the palace. All of this visiting the palace led him to develop a connection with the empress, naturally. However, rumors began to spread that Alexios had spent quite a bit of time in the gymnasium, or again, the women's quarters of the palace, What on earth could possibly draw his attention there so frequently, if not for some secret affair with the empress? These were two leading figures in Eastern Rome at the time, and they were apparently absolutely gorgeous creatures, and of around the same age. I believe, if I read correctly, Maria of Aliana was only like a year or two older than Alexius. So those rumors did hold some merit, to say the least. I personally believe, considering what I've read, I believe they were having an affair. But I want to be also very clear that, to be historically accurate, there is absolutely zero proof that it was occurring. Now, even though he was older, switching gears here, even though he was older, Isaac Komnenos pretty much knew that he would never have any imperial aspirations. But watching his little brother do his thing time and time again convinced him that Alexius actually had a pretty good chance. Maybe not now, maybe not soon, but someday, Besides, Nikephoros III was approaching 79 years old by 1080. It couldn't possibly be too much longer before another emperor would be needed, right? But that even had its problems, because young Constantine Ducas was currently propped up as the heir. That was a part of the deal, again, that Empress Maria made when she married Nikephoros III. As long as Constantine was Nikephoros III's heir, then that's where her loyalty would remain. However, in the year 1080, things would change, like immediately and drastically. In fact, Anna Komnene, in her epic biography of her father, called the Alexiad, says that in 1080, Nikephoros III made a fateful decision that would lead to his downfall. She writes, quote, "There was a certain Sideninos of Anatolian origin, of illustrious descent and fine appearance, thoughtful and of strong physique, on the verge of manhood, who, apart from other considerations, was a family relative of Nikephoros." End quote. Now remember, her deal with Nikephoros III when they married was that Maria's son would remain the heir to the imperial throne. But apparently the 11th century was just a century highlighted by emperors and empresses who enjoyed just shooting themselves in the foot at every turn. Nikephoros III pushed Constantine aside, and he named his kinsman, Sideninos, as his heir. Anna writes, quote, "It was a poor decision. He might have left the crown to Constantine, the empress's son, and in a way it was his right, because of his grandfather and father." End quote. She continues with, quote, "Had Nikephoros done so, he would have ensured his own safety to the end. The old man was unaware that he was sowing trouble for himself." End quote. Basically, you just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you, Nikki? It was at this very point that Alexius's and Isaac's visits to the palace became far more frequent, but they took on a different attitude from before. Anna writes, quote, "They were especially determined to win over the Empress Maria and convince her that they were wholly devoted to her in mind and soul." End quote. That is to say, they were, but your husband isn't. See what they were doing. So Nikephoros III began the year 1080 with young Constantine Ducas as his heir, and ended it with his kinsman Sideninos as his heir. You see the abrupt switch. But the year also ended with something else that was quite peculiar. And as the year progressed, the two Komnenoi brothers secretly approached the empress, and they swore their allegiance to her, as the empress was beyond miffed that her boy was cast aside so unceremoniously after the solemn promise that was made upon their marriage. As for Alexius's dealings with the emperor, an emperor that he had just committed treason against, mind you, he had to walk a fine line. The treason being the situation he was in with Maria. Anna tells us, quote, "Both of them, Alexius in particular, had the art of concealing their secret thoughts and private designs behind assumed expressions." End quote. Sneaky, sneaky. But she tells us that during this time, there were two slaves who were seething with jealousy in the palace. In fact, we've seen one already. Both of their names were Germanos and Borylus. And Borylus we heard a couple episodes ago. Berylos was the man who Alexios was ordered by the emperor to hand over a defeated Nikephoros Bryennius, and despite Alexios promising Bryennius no harm, Berylos defied the general's wishes and blinded the rebel leader anyway. Regardless, we clearly see a certain level of contempt held by Berylos, and now he was an accomplice with Germanos. These two men began a covert smear campaign that only increased as 1080 went on. Now, it's implied that Alexios and Isaac were pretty unaware of by these two former slaves turned imperial advisors and their campaign against them. But almost immediately, since joining in the secret pact with Empress Maria, they quickly learned the extent to their detractors in the highest halls of power, all orchestrated again by Germanos and Berylos. And the Komneni boys were able to keep ahead of things as their own plans began to take shape. By the end of 1080, Alexios Komnenos was far more than protector of the realm. Carr writes, quote, "If Constantinople had a mass media, the name Alexios Komnenos would have been in the headlines almost daily. As it was on everyone's lips. Intellectual and humble laborer alike shared a growing frustration at the incompetence of two emperors in a row, and the corruption and arrogance of the eunuchs of the court Camarilla. Against this sordid background, the reputation of Alexios shone out like a beacon. The public admired the fact that while still very young, he had built up a military record that would have done credit to a man twice his age." End quote. He was, you could say, a pearl of great price. But was it his time? See, we know what they say about casting pearls before swine. Was it too soon to stage a coup? Was a coup even necessary? I mean, the old emperor was, well, he was old. Nikephoros III may have been a great general decades before, and I do believe he was, to an extent, and a fine regional governor after that. He was regional governor of Anatolia. But he was really old at this point. Was the empire ready for a smart, capable, dashing, young, and already incredibly successful general to stage yet another coup for the empire? Would he be the pearl cast among the ungrateful and greedy swine of the empire? While Isaac and Alexios were debating on what to do next, the Turks put themselves on the move once again. See, the Turks, during this time, had been dealing with their own internal strife and coup attempts and expansion after Manzikert, and they had realized what every fast-growing empire has inevitably learned. When you expand at such a rapid pace, managing and ruling your entire realm becomes nearly impossible. Of course, the only exception to that rule seems to be who? The Mongols, but we'll get to them in time. Cracks are created in the power structures when this happens. Rebellions erupt among the groups recently conquered. This happens. And supplying each region in need with fresh soldiers simply becomes untenable. It would eventually be known as the Great Seljuk Empire, but they had some growing pains to overcome before that could even come close to happening. Well, their Anatolian leadership was still outwardly loyal to Sultan Malik Shah. Remember, Malik Shah was the son of Sultan Alp Arslan from Manzikert fame. But they did manage to break away somewhat autonomously. The new Seljuk vassal state, which covered all territories taken by the Turks in Anatolia, this was now known as the Sultanate of Rum. Now, a quick note about the name Rum. These Turks in Anatolia were after one thing: Constantinople. They didn't realize it when they went in there, but by this time, they wanted Constantinople. Now, why? Having been in the region for decades now, they'd heard plenty about the grandeur and magnificence of Constantinople, and by proxy, of Rome. Remember, the Eastern Romans may have spoken Greek, but they were 100% true believers that they were the real Romans of old, the true beneficiaries of the title. Remember, the word Byzantine didn't come into play for centuries, right? no one at the time called themselves Byzantines. They were Romans, to be crystal clear about it. These Seljuks in Anatolia wanted that city, and they wanted that title. They wanted the grandeur and magnificence and history and tradition and influence and power that came with the word Rome, with the word Roman. Rum, R-U-M, is a variant on the name Rome, thus the Sultanate of Rum. So the leaders of the Sultanate of Rum in 1080 and 1081 began amassing their forces and pushing their northwestern and western boundaries, that is, toward Constantinople. Though their ultimate goal was the capital city, their more immediate goals were to control the coasts of the Black Sea to the north, the Ionian Sea to the west, and the Mediterranean Sea to the south, effectively cutting Constantinople off from the highly lucrative tourism of the Holy Land, and its riches also in trade that were found there. As of 1080, the Seljuks had pushed their way into Jerusalem, thus pushing out the Fatimids out of Cairo. And they were making serious noise about hitting Cairo itself as well. The Eastern Romans were still in control of Antioch, Caesarea, and Nicaea, which were all major hubs of populations and commerce between that road between Constantinople and Jerusalem. For those with an eye on the Crusades, you can clearly see the chessboard taking shape here. Word came of these new Seljuk raids getting frightfully close to the capital, but when word came of a small city actually falling, the game changed overnight. The city of Kyzikos is around 100 miles away from Constantinople, as the crow flies. And really frightening part of this whole thing is that Kyzikos was a port city on the Sea of Marmara. Now, for those who are not familiar with the area's geography, that's okay. When you're exiting the Ionian Sea heading toward the Black Sea, right? Even before you reach Constantinople, you must pass through the Sea of Marmara. It's not very big, but it's a day or less travel by boat to reach the mouth of the Black Sea. The capture of Kyzikos effectively gave the Seljuks something they'd never had before: access to a major sea route. Think about that. Like, the Sea of Marmara was a major sea route, and they shared it with the sole superpower in the region, which happened to be an extraordinarily weakened state at the moment. Well, Alexios and his brother Isaac, who was really always at his side during these years, were immediately summoned to the Blachernae Palace in Constantinople to speak with the emperor about this. The problem was that the brothers, through their relationship with Empress Maria, were acutely aware now of the scheming Germanos and Borilos, who could take any opportunity presented to them to take the brothers out. What's more is that Isaac Komnenos was already at the palace when the emperor sent for him. He and Alexios and Maria had agreed, through the strong suggestion of, here's a new name, Anna Deliceni, the Komneni matriarch, scheming away behind the scenes this whole time. That's right, Alexios' mother, Anna Deliceni, was kind of a mastermind of his entire rise to power. That in order to remove much suspicion, the boys should rarely be seen at the palace together. Anna writes, quote, "When he," that is Isaac, "saw his brother enter, contrary to the agreement they had made, he went up to him, asking why he was there. Alexios at once told him the reason. He said, quote, 'The emperor summoned me,' end quote. But both therefore went in and made the customary obeisance. As it was time for a meal, the emperor invited them to stay for a while and required them to share his table. They were separated, one sitting on the right, the other on the left, opposite one another. After a short pause, they began to assess the other, looking sullen. The young men feared a sudden attack. The slaves, that is, meaning Germanos and Borilos, who again were both former slaves and now advisors to the emperor. She says, the slaves must have devised some imminent danger for them. In desperation, they cast furtive glances at one another. End quote. Now, Anna Komneni narrates the next piece masterfully, so I'll read her very next paragraph, which outlines a pretty intense moment for the Komnene boys. She writes, quote, "For a long time they had been winning the friendship of the emperor's retinue, by kindly words, by courtesies, and all kinds of polite attentions. Their affability had even persuaded the cook to regard them with a friendly eye. One of Isaac's servants approached this man and said, 'Tell my master that Kyzikos has fallen. A letter has come from there with this news.' He at once served the food on the table and at the same time in a low voice told Isaac what his servant had said. Isaac passed on the message to his brother by slight movements of his lips. Alexios easily grasped what he meant, as quickly as lightning reading his lips. The burden of anxiety was lifted. Both breathed easily again. When they had regrouped, they considered what reply they should have ready if someone questioned them about Kyzikos. They also thought what advice they should offer if the emperor asked their opinion." End quote. So Isaac was already in the palace when Alexios responded to his emperor's summons. There was a moment when Isaac saw him, and both brothers, surprised at why the emperor would need an immediate meeting. Neither knew at first. They had no idea what the summons was about. The emperor suggested a meal, and well, you don't turn down a meal from the emperor when he offers it. So the two confused brothers sat down across from one another at a table to eat, but they were well aware of Germanos and Barilos in the palace scheming for their demise. Did the emperor find out about the deal with the empress? Could the food be poisoned? They shared glances with one another as the food was served, but they both breathed this massive sigh of relief. Don't worry, it's not us. It's just the Seljuks inching closer and closer to us. There's a level of comedy to this, but there's no question they didn't find it at all funny at the time. It's pretty tense. Alexios quickly drew up a new tactic. Flatter the emperor. Anna quotes her father when he turns to the emperor at the dinner table and says this, quote, "All that matters is that your majesty should be well. The besiegers of the town will surely pay sevenfold for what they have done." End quote. The emperor was pleased with this response. Anna tells us that. In fact, after that, Anna says that Alexios and Isaac, quote, "made it their business to befriend the emperor's retinue even more, to give no chance whatever to their adversaries of plotting against them. No excuse at all for hating them. On the contrary, they set out to win the affection, sympathy, and outspoken support of all." End quote. If their visits to the palace weren't frequent enough already, Isaac upped his own game and visited more frequently. It was easier for him, though, because he had already married Maria's cousin. He had much more of a pretense for his visits than had Alexios. But not for long. If you remember from the top of the show, the prophet Daniel interpreted the mysterious writing on King Belshazzar's wall as Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. So far, we've seen this play out like this. The first Mene, interpreted as God has numbered the days of your kingdom. Well, this could be seen as the revolts of Rusel de Bayol, Nikephoros Bryennius, and General Basilakios. The second Mene, interpreted as God has declared the end of your kingdom, could be seen as Nikephoros III breaking his oath to his wife to keep her son as his heir. Now the third word, Tekel, interpreted as you have been weighed on the scales and been found wanting. Well, this could be seen in what happens next. Remember, Alexios' mother, Anna Delasini, was a crafty lady, and she was always working in the background to make things happen for her sons. But she had also raised boys who were obedient and trusting of her decisions. She was working several steps ahead of nearly everyone else. She had laid the groundwork for what happened next, but they had to be very, very careful. Anna Komnene, her granddaughter, remember, writes this, quote, "The plan, however, was concealed and divulged to nobody at all. Like fishermen, they were careful not to frighten away the catch before they were ready." End quote. See, the plan that Anna Delasini had been slowly unfolding was ready to commence, especially in the wake of the 3 dangerous revolts her insanely popular son Alexios had put down, especially in the wake of the emperor declaring a new heir. See, it was time for Alexios and Isaac to run away. Yeah. Now, not in some dramatic way, a sly way. Provide a good reason to skip town. But one thing needed to happen before that. Something that would most likely tip off that something was amiss. See, they convinced Empress Maria to take a stand against her husband, which was a very dangerous game to play. Empress Maria and Alexios Komnenos were, of course, strongly rumored to be having an affair, but he still needed unfettered access to her, either in person or through letter, if the larger plan was to succeed. In order to give him that, Empress Maria actually adopted Alexios Komnenos as her son. Yeah. And since he was older than her other son, Constantine, he was her heir, thus setting up a counterbalance to the claim of Sidenianos. And who do you think the empire would go for when Nikephoros III died? Which could be at any moment, by the way. Some obscure kinsman of the emperor who just popped on the scene because the emperor said his name? Or would the empire side with the hero of the realm, who had a proven track record of bravery, cunning, and devotion to the people's safety and well-being? I mean, it's a no-brainer. And here's the kicker. Nikephoros III, emperor or not, had no say whatsoever with who his empress adopted. That's not something he had any power over. Coming seemingly out of the blue to the emperor, who was completely unaware of anything the Komnenoi had been planning, as far as Nikephoros III was concerned, he was witnessing from his standpoint, some invisible hand scrawling something he couldn't quite make sense of on the wall right in front of his eyes. But every coup is a double-edged sword, if you think about it. It really depends on how it plays out, but the rebelling side is one edge of the sword, while the people fighting against that rebellion is the other. But either way, someone's going to get cut. It could be a fairly harmless scrape, or it could be a fatal gutting. But someone's getting the business end of one of those two edges. When the adoption became public, Germanos and Borilos, driven by hatred and jealousy for the Komnenoi brothers, quickly got to work. This is where things get really scooting along here. Anna Komnene, referring to these two guys as slaves still, tells us, quote, their idea was to summon the young men one night without the knowledge of the emperor and get rid of them by gouging out their eyes on a trumped-up charge, end quote. Well, the goodwill and courtesies toward all the palace servants and advisors must have paid off because Isaac was alerted to this plot just before it unfolded. And Anna writes, quote, they knew they were in imminent danger. With great reluctance, they decided their one hope of safety lay in rebellion, end quote. See, they were actually okay with what I can only reason to be a sort of cold coup. I'm admittedly searching for the right words there, but just as a Cold War doesn't involve any direct confrontation between the two major sides, only proxy actions, the Komnenoi boys were willing to let this adoption ride until the emperor's death and then allowing that to play out because, I mean, come on, the Alexios Komnenos was clearly the best choice for emperor, especially when his only competition was a young boy and some obscure Anatolian that no one had ever heard about. But when their lives were threatened immediately, the situation changed immediately. Course correction here. Anna Komnene follows it up perfectly with this statement, quote unquote, hard necessity had driven them to it. The it here is all-out rebellion, a coup de grace, a sort of hot coup, I suppose you could say. Alexios dispatched letters to all his loyal generals in the West. Remember, Alexios was named Domesticos of the West 2 years earlier, after the defeat of Nikephoros Bryennius, who was the then Domesticos of the West, so he took a spot. In fact, in appreciation, after Basilakios' rebellion was put down, in appreciation, Nikephoros III had actually elevated Alexios to Megas Domestikos, which gave Alexios a certain level of respect and authority over the East as well. Alexios had built up quite a contingent of loyalists over the previous few years. The pretense he used, however, was a sneaky one. He told them, and the emperor, that he was building an army to march against the Agarenes, which is the name of the Turkish tribe responsible for the fall of Kyzikos. Far be it of the emperor to rein in his most able general to put down this seemingly minor, though, to be clear, still quite significant, given the geography, invasion to his southwest. Kyzikos, to be clear, was figuratively speaking, halfway to the back door of the Eastern Roman backyard. It was close. Boryilos approached Nikephoros III and convinced him to summon Alexios to defend himself against Boryilos' charge that Alexios was gathering an army in the capital to overthrow the emperor. Now, Alexios Komnenos stood before the emperor and said the following in his defense, quote, "The army is in fact dispersed, and individual men have come here from all provinces on receipt of my order. Those who see them arriving here in groups from different parts of the empire might imagine that all the army is gathering. They are deceived by appearances, nothing more." End quote. Well, the emperor was either convinced of Alexios' argument or he was becoming more and more accepting of the writing on the wall. Anna says that Boryilos, quote-unquote, protested vigorously, but it was of no use. The emperor allowed Alexios to do his thing, as he's allowed time and time again in the past. Besides, at the end of the day, Kyzikos was too close for comfort. Eastern Rome had to respond. But men like Germanos and Boryilos were tenacious, as most devious people are. They immediately devised an ambush for Alexios and Isaac. Here's the problem with people like Germanos and Boryilos. In their blind hatred for their chosen enemies, they become so enraged when things don't go their way that they get careless. They start to show signs of their alternative plans, their innermost thoughts, and eventually they get caught. It was absolutely no secret to anyone in the palace that Boryilos was the brains and Germanos was the brawn. But they said the wrong thing in front of the wrong person, and they were completely unaware of it. See, an Alanian man in the palace overheard their plans for the Komneno brothers and snuck out one night and visited Alexios. Why didn't this man go to the emperor he served? So, if you remember, where did Maria come from? She was the daughter of the king of Georgia. The region inside Georgia that she was born in, that she hailed from, was called Alania. This man went to the Komnenoi because he was from the contingent of servants every bride brought with her into a marriage at the time. His allegiance was first and foremost to his empress. And who was the empress's new adopted son? That's right, Alexios. In fact, this guy wasn't just a servant, though. This man had started off a part of the empress's group when she married Michael VII, but by Nikephoros III, this man had reached the rank of magistros, which equated to a trusted advisor to the emperor. What's more is that this man had befriended old Nikephoros III, and yet he still chose the empress and her adopted son over notifying the emperor himself. Anna Komnena writes, quote, "Alexios took the man to his mother and Isaac. When they learned this frightful news, they decided that the time had come to put into practice their secret plan." End quote. Now, 2 days later, Alexios heard word that his forces were fast approaching. In fact, one of his most loyal officers, an Armenian warrior named Pakorianos, had a hefty contingent in the Thracian town of Tsourolos. Alexios rode to meet this Pakorianos. The two men met, and Alexios told him everything. The plans hatched by Anna Dalasini, his mother, the reasons behind the adoption, and the bit about Germanos and Boryilos. And this is where we see the type of men who existed 1,000 years ago. Men who were loyal to a system, and not necessarily to a person. Pakorianos looked Alexios straight in the eye and said this, quote, "If you leave here at daybreak tomorrow, I will follow you, and I will fight willingly at your side. But if you defer your plan to the next day, I must warn you that I shall go to the emperor without delay and denounce both you and your men without hesitation." End quote. What's interesting about that is that Alexios could have arrested Pakorianos on the spot, maybe even killed him, trump him up on some charges, I don't know. He could have swept the whole thing under the rug and moved on. But this was the life of a fighting man long ago. They actually held principles close to them. and they lived by those principles, and they were willing to die by those principles. Pakourianos was loyal to Alexios, sure, but he was more loyal to the empire. He laid down his terms, which included supporting Alexios because he believed and he trusted in Alexios' leadership. Deep down, Pakourianos believed Alexios would have made a fine emperor, maybe even an exceptional one, certainly one who would be better off than old Nikephoros III. But at the end of the day, the longer Alexios dragged it out, Pakourianos knew he would lose hope. Pakourianos believed in Rome above all. If the man presenting a coup to his face was also the type of man who was willing to kick the can down the street, then he was certainly not emperor material. Besides, and most probably importantly, Pakourianos would be an accessory to treason the longer that dragged out. He knew about it. If he sat on this, then he would be a traitor to his beloved Rome. The phrase, "damn the man, save the empire," comes to mind right now. Alexios accepted Pakourianos and hastily made his way toward another potential ally. But first, hey, nobody works for free, right? You don't, I don't, neither did Pakourianos 1,000 years ago. Alexios appreciated strong people like him, and he was generous with his gifts throughout his life. He treated his subordinates quite well, much like Robert Guiscard in many respects. Both men were insanely generous to those who supported them wholeheartedly. Anna writes, quote, "His men had extraordinary affection for Alexios because he was a very liberal man, with hands unusually ready to dispense gifts, even though he was not by any means seriously rich. He was certainly not a man who coveted or pursued riches for their own sake. It was not customary to judge a man's liberality by the amount of money he distributes, but rather by the character of the giver. One could define a person of few resources who gives within his means as liberal. On the other hand, the very rich man who buries his wealth underground or provides for the needy less than he could afford might not improperly be described as a second Croesus or a gold-crazed Midas, a greedy, stingy skinflint." End quote. Before leaving, Alexios promised Pakourianos that should he become emperor, then Pakourianos would skyrocket in status from a mere officer to domestikos of either the West or the East, depending on how things worked out. Now, that was a massive promise to make, but Pakourianos' deal still stood. Alexios must move the very next morning. The next man was a longtime ally of Alexios's, both in the field and off it. This warrior's name was Humbertopoulos, and Humbertopoulos readily agreed to Alexios' appeal for help. Everything, it seemed, was falling into place, though pushed along sooner than they'd hoped. The way Alexios saw things, there was no better time to act than now. There were no major uprisings or invasions, short of that Kyzikos thing, but that could be worked out as soon as the dust settled, and he's emperor. In his camp were, well, two of the most capable military minds in the empire, Humbertopoulos and Pakourianos, along with scores of other small armies, including currently converging on Constantinople under the pretense of dealing with Kyzikos. He also had his older brother, Isaac, who was quite politically adept as well as a warrior himself, though not nearly as successful as Alexios. He was still a man after Alexios' own heart. He had his mother, the political and intellectual juggernaut and supposed mastermind of this whole thing, Anna Delasini. He had the Empress herself, Maria, who was now his adopted mother, which still makes me laugh, making him really close to being a rightful heir to the throne. And let's be honest, the support and love from the entire populace of not only the capital, but of the empire that he seemingly continuously saved time and time again for the better part of a decade, well, they watched all the other generals fail one after another. Now, being officially married to a now 15-year-old Irene Doukaina made Alexios a son-in-law to both Andronikos Doukas, yeah, remember that guy? The guy who ran from the battlefield at Manzikert? Yeah, that Andronikos. So he was a son-in-law to Andronikos Doukas, which made Alexios Komnenos a grandson-in-law to the mighty and still very active Caesar John Doukas. Irene's mother shouldn't be overlooked either, as she came with a strong lineage as well. Alexios was also now through his marriage with Irene, the son-in-law to Maria of Bulgaria, a Bulgarian princess to Tsar Ivan Vladislav, the current leader of the Bulgars. Now, that's an important one you'll want to keep a hold of, that connection. So in addition to all of his current allies, he was also enjoying a number of important connections as well. So at this point, there were really only two other major components to notify and lock in the support from. The first was John Ducas, who was a Caesar at this point. Remember, the rank of Caesar occupied the space between the emperor and the megas domesticus, which is what Alexius was. So Caesar John Ducas was one rung above Alexius and one rung below the emperor. The other was Alexius's brother-in-law. We haven't mentioned him yet. And he was currently a general, quite successful, quite beloved general in charge of a large army fighting the Seljuks in Anatolia. He was yet another Nikephoros in our story, but we'll just refer to this man by his last name, as he hailed from another quite prominent Byzantine house. We'll call him Melesinos. Word was quickly sent to shore up John Ducas's support, and in the meantime, Alexius gathered his army just north of the city and publicly announced his soldiers, and thus the Byzantine world, because of how fast news spread, that they were now gathered not to see the immediate release of Kyzikos like they were told. No, now they were gathered together under one banner, the banner of Alexios Komnenos, and that they would march against the emperor due to the emperor's inability to correct the empire's downward spiral because of his broken oath to Empress Maria regarding her son Constantine's status as heir, which is ironic because he now had a better claim, it seemed Alexius did, or at least a more likely way to succeed that claim. And that the empire's own men, here referring to Borilos and Germanos, plotting to blind both Alexius and Isaac and throwing them aside. Those were the roots of the empire's problems. Alexius, being as popular as he was, almost immediately gained his army's support, and like so many generals before who staged a coup with an army at his back, Alexius announced that they were moving out at daybreak, thus making good on his promise to Pakorianos. This was, of course, with wild exclamations and cheers from the soldiers gathered, which were in the thousands. But there was just one more thing, though. I know this episode just never really seems to end, does it? That's what I felt like writing it. But bear with me just another couple minutes. To recap, what Emperor Nikephoros III is seeing being scrawled across his wall is this: Mene, the three revolts challenging his rule, or God has numbered your days as ruler of the kingdom. Mene, Nikephoros III breaking his oath to Maria and choosing a new heir, or God has decided your reign is at an end. Tekel, Maria allies herself with the Komnenoi and adopts Alexios Komnenos as her son, making him a rival heir to Nikephoros III's choice, or the interpretation of you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Well, now we can't end the episode without hitting Upharsin, the final word written on the wall of King Belshazzar. Now, the prophet Daniel interprets this as, your kingdom has been divided and shall be given to the Persians and the Medes. Now, I'm going to take some liberties here, but I think there's something oddly satisfying about how appropriate this is applied to this chapter of Alexius' story. See, as Alexius was preparing to contact his brother-in-law, Melesinos, in Anatolia in order to bring not only his western forces to bear on the capital, but also the southern Byzantine forces from the other side, well, Alexius received a letter from Melesinos out of the blue, actually, asking Alexius to gather an army in the west and, bring it to the capital because Melesinos had already declared himself emperor too. Yeah, just keeps getting more and more complex. As of February 1081, there were two claimants to the throne of Eastern Rome, both brothers-in-law, mind you, as Melesinos was married to Isaac and Alexios' sister. And by the way, Melissenos and Alexios were on very friendly terms with one another. And there was also one actual emperor of Eastern Rome. So there were three at play here. Oh, and there was a semi-autonomous realm out east whose leader was currently beginning to mint his own face on his own coins. Yeah, so now also officially we have a breakaway state as well, led by a man named Philaretos Frahimios. And all the while, Emperor Nikephoros III Botaniates, nearing 79 years old, was in the palace, surrounded, and utterly done with all this imperial nonsense, this crap that he's dealing with. He was happy being the scapegoat to the empire's current woes if it meant he could just retire in peace. His spirit was willing, but his flesh was weak, you could say. He truly did have the best intentions. Being emperor, to some extent, was not a game of power and manipulation to him, but a genuine labor of love. He was leader, maybe not geographically, but at least philosophically, of the world's city set on a hill. His reign would be yet another drop in the bucket of Roman rulers, but if he played his cards right, he could still make it out of this debacle by the skin of his teeth. He could stand and fight against these rebellions, but he was a man of wisdom at that point, and he knew a soft answer turns away wrath. Sure, what these men were doing was a direct assault on his legacy, but it was not a time to fight for personal honor. Not when the empire itself was hanging perilously on its edge and its enemies were just chomping at the bit to invade. It was a time to turn the other cheek. Alexios, it seemed to him, was the more reasonable of the two men marching against him, as he knew Alexios Komnenos far better than he knew Melissenos, so that would be his tact. We have to cut this off at some point. And with two armies marching on Constantinople, both vying for the crown, this might be the best place to do that. Upharsin, remember, your kingdom shall be divided between the Persians and the Medes. The gist of this is simply that your kingdom will be divided into two. It's so weak at the point of your fall, King Belshazzar, Emperor Nikephoros III, that it cannot remain intact. Remember, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Almost half of the empire had already fallen to the Seljuk Turks, and more had fallen since he took the crown, most notably Kyzikos on the Sea of Marmara, dangerously close to the capital. This leaves the other half, who is being fought over by two brothers-in-law. Nikephoros III could clearly see the writing on the wall. Thank you for all your support. Until next time.